Okay, I'm going to count down now. 3, 2, 1, go.
Welcome everyone to concurrent session number 3 on day 1 of the National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism in Higher Education. I'm Henry Yu. I'm an associate professor in history at the University of British Columbia, and I'm kind of welcoming you to this panel. I want to first acknowledge that I am joining you from the unceded ancestral traditional territories of Musqueam First Nation in Vancouver. We are on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. And it's important in some sense to building from the theme of this forum, building solidarity, that we all acknowledge where we are in terms of being on Indigenous land. In British Columbia in particular, because 98% of British Columbia is recognized as unceded territory that is neither in any way been conquered or discussed in treaties. This is unceded, unilaterally dispossessed land. We're uninvited guests on the land of Indigenous peoples in British Columbia. Across other parts of Canada, I know that the situation is different, so encourage everyone to actually understand where you are in terms of Indigenous territories. I'm going to ask everyone to self-introduce on this really important panel about faculty representation, recruitment, retention, and promotion in a second. But I wanted to also sort of frame where we are at as I've been listening to this morning's sessions, the plenaries. The conversation has gone straight, in some sense, to where it needs to be, which is an understanding of what is in fact wrong with our institutions of higher education, both in terms of themselves being products of a colonial society, being also products of a society that created the evaluation systems, the criteria for sorting students, for sorting knowledge around colonial knowledge regimes, and continues to sort knowledge, to evaluate the value of knowledge, to create criteria for not just recruitment, but I think one of the things that I think will come up in this panel's discussion is the retention, promotion, and evaluates what are forms of knowledge that are superior to others and therefore get validated. I would also say, just from personal experience, 17 years teaching at UBC, but also having come from the University of California system before that, and then before that, having been born and raised in British Columbia, that in going to the United States and teaching at a large public university, I was really shocked coming back to UBC and coming back to British Columbia, Canada, at a lot of forms of ongoing structures that were unquestioned. So I think part of what we need to do is to unveil some of the things that perhaps we don't see, and to not to use a term that came up in the previous panel, just to ours to right now, one of the plenaries, to talk about EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, as the lipstick onto a structure that perhaps needs and requires larger changes. But why don't I actually ask each of our panelists today, who come from different parts of the university. So we're very fortunate to have two faculty members at different stages of their career at different institutions, but also to have two people who are involved in on the human resources side and the faculty recruitment and retention and promotion side. People have experience also seeing from within structures of evaluation and the criteria upon which we value our faculty and the effects that they have on our university. So I'm going to start with Davina. If you can say a little bit about yourself and introduce yourselves to everyone.
Hi, thank you so much for that opening, Henry. I'm Davina. I'm a senior HR partner here at X University, and I guess to introduce myself, I've been in post-secondary education for about 10 years, and prior to that I was in the healthcare sector, actually in British Columbia as well. So I've had the exposure to, recruitment in both provinces. And then I guess more specifically in the last, 10 years, it's in regards to faculty recruitment. I'm really thrilled to be able to join for this conversation. And I'm so glad you brought up the EDI lipstick from the plenary just before this. It was fantastic. And I think it's going to be part of the vocabulary going forward, which makes it really hard from being in an HR profession. So just saying hi.
Great. Thanks, Davina. And yeah, it is a very powerful metaphor. The allusion as well to putting lipstick on the pig to try to make it look better. I think it's an ugly metaphor in some ways that perhaps also is unveiling a bit of an ugly truth. I'm going to go around in what is the four photos that I have in the order, and so Jeongmin Kim, who joins us again from a university that is embroiled in some issues with Equity University right now. But
okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you, Henry, for the introduction. So yes, I am Jeongmin Kim, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Manitoba, the Treaty 1 and the homeland of the Métis Nation. As Henry said, we are the University of Manitoba Faculty Association is currently on strike. So I am a member of the union, so I am also on strike. And I hope that we have maybe time to talk about those retention and recruitment issues from those workers' perspective during our conversation. But also, as I was listening to Henry's introduction, that I also was before I joined the University of Manitoba here, that I was a graduate student at a U.S. Private university. So I guess that my experience, I'm new to Canada and I'm new to maybe academia as a junior faculty member. So I'm a former graduate student and also a new faculty member, those kind of differences, and as well as my experience in the US and a kind of private university setting and now a kind of public university setting. So those kind of Canadian kind of post-secondary kind of education approach and US approach, maybe those kind of things I can also maybe address a little bit. Anyway, yeah, I really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jeongmin. And next up, just to do a quick intro, is Zenab Pathan, who again joins us from having a perspective, again, on perhaps multiple levels of the university administration. So please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Henry, and I'm so happy to be here and part of this conversation. I feel really, really privileged, so thank you for inviting me. My official role is Director of Faculty Recruitment and Development at Ryerson University, and as you all probably know, there's been a lot of excitement or activities happening with respect to EDI in our university and going through the name change as well, or that process right now. There's lots of reflection, lots of things that I'm happy to share and also learn from you all in this conversation. I've spent almost 20 years now in the university sector, so I have a lot of experience to draw from in the different areas and in my current role as well, looking after sort of faculty going through the various stages of the life cycle as well. So looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks. We're so happy to have that kind of level of experience. That this is not a problem that just started recently. In fact, it's embedded into the structures is something that we've heard all morning. And so it's great to have someone with several decades of sort of insight into that. Finally, we have Derrick Lee, who again is faculty joining us. And so, yeah, please tell us sort of where you're coming from.
Hi, Henry, and to the rest of the panelists, as well as the watchers, all brown. First, my name is Derrick Lee. I'm at CNFX University. So first, kind of in tone with how Henry started this talk, I'd like to acknowledge that CNFX is located on the unceded and traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq, who have maintained a connection to this land here in Nova Scotia. I myself, I come from an academic family, so my father actually was a statistics professor as well, at Memorial University in the obviously the East Coast. Shout out to Henry. I did my doctorate at UBC, so I jumped to the other coast, and now I'm back on the East Coast. So one of the things that particularly is of interest to me in the context of EDI is some of the challenges that particularly rural-based universities face when it comes to recruiting and supporting minorities, because obviously, particularly when you're in Antigonish, in a very small town, we have run into several issues. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Thanks, Derrick. And I'm glad you are here precisely to remind us that it's not all the big universities in the major cities. We often see Canada as heavily urban, heavily concentrated into city spaces, and many of our universities are. But many of our public universities are actually in other areas, and so I'm glad you'll bring that perspective to us. I'm going to kind of open up, and perhaps drawing a little bit on what several of you already said, by asking each of you to just talk about what you see as the major obstacles, in fact, whether it's to recruitment, to retention, or to promotion. I mean, what do you see as the things that are in the way? And I will perhaps even just go a little bit on that from my own perspective. And one of the things in the way for me is actually not even be able to understand the problem, because we actually don't collect data. And one of the things that really was a difference when I was in the University of California is we could tell which departments who they were, and whether there was some with a lack of diversity and whether they needed to do better, or whether some departments were not retaining people, that they were bleeding, so to speak, people of color or faculty of color, or that they were stuck, that they weren't being promoted at the same. There was many ways in which data was there for us to be able to analyze, and going to Derrick's father's profession, there were statistics that we could use to identify. This to me is one of the obstacles. That's the largest problem actually in Canada. We just are told again and again we're not allowed to collect those kind of statistics, and so banging our heads against just knowing whether there's an issue or a problem. So but I know that for each of you, you have perhaps you see others, and through your own experience and through your own perspectives, but I'll throw mine out first. As one of the largest obstacles is our inability to actually even see the problem sometimes, or understand the depth of it, or the structural ways in which it is a pattern across a whole institution. But I don't know, I don't want to force each of you, so anyone who's ready to go first. Yeah, Zenab.
Actually, I'll just build on what you said about data, because I know that that's been something that our hiring committees have been struggling for years, and they found it to be quite frustrating walking into training where equity, diversity, and inclusion was promoted, but not being able to actually have the appropriate infrastructure in place to be able to, demonstrate that they were making efforts and that their efforts were actually resulting in something of value. So we actually just recently launched an applicant diversity self-ID in our portal, which I'm really, really excited about. We'll have to see how that works out. That's one part of the puzzle, obviously, right? There's the data on existing representation, and because it's voluntary, it's always challenging, right? Because you're always sort of hoping that people will complete those surveys and that you get enough of a response rate to be able to have some confidence in the data as well. And I know, also there's various different elements to how the data can be useful or not useful. So for instance, you can look at your student population, and you can look at your departmental representation and say, oh, maybe we're doing okay. But what if the representation within your student population is also low in comparison to what's out there in the community, right? Yeah. So it's actually very complex when you break it down. Sometimes, for instance, when you might even have, a small department with only 1 or 2 faculty members that belong to a particular group, in percentage that might look good, but actually, in the grand scheme of things, it's not so good. And then, of course, there are other issues as well when you have a lonely, sort of faculty member belonging to one equity group, and the isolation they feel, and all of those other social issues that come up as well. But yeah, all of this to say, data is extremely important, but it's also very, very complex, and it has to be continuous sort of improvement.
Yeah. Thanks for, and I take that point about the checkbox approach to data also is
Yeah.
incredibly dangerous. That somehow, look, we've got 3, we're doing good, or we're overrepresented. Like we've got more Asians than we should. There's this strange way in which the weaponization of statistics, which often is used as actually the reason, privacy reasons, or data is complicated and therefore we can't really collect it, and the categories. But it's interesting. Again, you've raised the point of how we use data, who uses data, who's it for. That often is actually the larger issue behind that. But and I know that there's other issues that will come up, but other kinds of obstacles and things that others have seen. Yeah, Derrick.
So myself, I'm actually also a statistician. Surprise. But actually, I'd rather focus on something not data related, but more about the culture, because I think that obviously plays a very large role when we talk about underrepresented groups, because particularly, so 2 things kind of come to mind. The first one was an experience from my own father. So he left Oregon State University to go to Newfoundland, and this was in the 70s. And at that point in time, my dad and I never really discussed the specifics of why Newfoundland or whatever, but some of the experiences he did discuss with me was how delays, let's call that, in his career, and how certain faculty members didn't exactly appreciate him being there. And obviously that creates a very toxic environment when it comes to the idea of retaining and recruitment. But then from the other perspective, particularly in the context of blossoming and to help train the next generation of researchers, that's also another big issue that we also may not be addressing appropriately, particularly when in the context of who are their mentors. So from my perspective of math and stats, one of the biggest problems that we deal with, particularly in the context of EDI, is how often math is viewed as a boys' club. So then how do you rectify that issue when, like, we've seen statistically that girls have just the same amount of skills analytically as boys up until high school? They actually exceed them, but then for whatever reason, the culture of it when it comes to university changes something. And I will openly admit that and I even talked about my students about this when we talk about our mixed method research classes, that when I was a kid, I can still remember one of my teachers saying to one of my female peers that you do math pretty good for a girl. And at the point in time, it was never really, I didn't really think about it because this is back in the 80s. But today, when I think about it, this is such a backhanded compliment, and I don't even want to use the term compliment, but again, the culture really plays a really large role in influencing where a lot of these people go, the supports that they need, the mentors that they really need to help them become the next generation of researchers. And that, in my opinion, is a really big component of something that, for lack of a better term, we need grassroots there before we can really make meaningful changes.
Thanks for raising that, and I know that many of people out there have heard phrases like workplace culture, and again, talking about norms of a workplace as if they are somehow cultural, in the same way that there is something called Chinese culture or Korean culture or whatever. It's interesting to me that those norms often are built around evaluation, around confidence. We talk about imposter syndromes. Like, I feel like I'm an imposter because I might not belong here. And again, we often blame the victim of where's this lack of confidence coming from? Talked about your evaluation systems, like that other people are evaluating you or your father. What criteria are they using? What norms are they applying? And how do those become parts of what, for many, I think, faculty of color, and also in terms of a lot of female faculty, women, those who are just underrepresented in that cultural norm of what belongs in academia. So I'm glad you raised some of these issues, which are part of the experience, I think, of a lot of faculty. And often it becomes internalized, and it's like, is it me? I guess I don't belong, or I guess I'm not doing something right, or it must be something that's about me. I remember a colleague once said, you know, you speak English really well, and it's not a compliment to have that told to you if you're a faculty of color. So thanks for raising some of those issues, Derrick. Davina, Jeongmin, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Davina. I guess I think Davina, I think your hand went up microscopically earlier. Why don't you go first? Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, I just wanted to add to the, you know, especially when we talk about workplace norms, I see it often being discussed in terms of suitability and fit within, you know, I'm very curious to hear about Derrick and Jeongmin's from an academic perspective, because I can see it being magnified in terms of academia, in terms of what is a norm in terms of expertise, how research is completed. I'd love to hear more about that. I think one of the other obstacles that I think about may not be the most significant or major, but Henry kind of alluded to it almost. So he's kind of talked about, you know, we're not allowed to collect the data, or we're not allowed to be able to do something. I think there's legislation and there's, you know, collective agreements, kind of speaking to Jeongmin's point earlier. There's been a lot of, you know, language that has been implemented and created that is oppressive and can actually cause, you know, racism and racist structures to kind of flourish in the institution. And I think that, you know, it's been in existence for a very long time, and we're trying to kind of correct those things. But I do think it ends up creating an additional barrier that we don't necessarily see outright. But once you hit it pretty hard.
Are you raising something about the not allowed to is also a way of suppressing and erasing the existence of problems? I hear a little bit of that in terms of being told, you know, why can't we collect this? It's like, do you think there's other things going on with the not wanting to know?
I think it's beyond, like, I mean, we understand that there are systems of structural racism in every aspect, including the law, including, you know, various different mechanisms, that internal procedures that may exist inadvertently or explicitly. And I think that we have obligations to sort of question those things, but I think as an obstacle to what we're doing for faculty recruitment, that can sometimes be a pretty clear obstacle. Mm-hmm. That's all I'm hoping to try.
Thanks for raising this, because you know, one of my colleagues who is associate dean in the Faculty of Science here at UBC, you know, one of the things he brought to it as a research scientist was just, he wanted to know the numbers. How many people who were, you know, BIPOC were applying? How many people were making the shortlist? How many? The amount of grief and pushback he had just to collect. But then what he's finding in the numbers was really revealing, because you know, you find that when people get dropped out is perhaps not always when you think it is. And so again, even understanding the problem and
sorry, Henry, it might be me. I think you cut out. Possibly dropped off. We've lost our moderator.
Jeongmin, do you want to chime in? Because you're the person to talk. Oh, I think you're muted.
Okay, I don't know. Should we wait until he comes back, or I mean, I can speak. I'm not really sure.
Well, I'm hoping it's not a technical issue, because it could take him a few minutes to actually like restart the computer. So I feel like, for the sake of the audience, we want to continue some sort of conversation.
Yes, that sounds good. I don't know, like those, like I was going to talk about this kind of like issue with quantifying those representation kind of aspect. Because I mean, especially after I started as a junior faculty member, and I realized that all these, like when we apply for jobs, that we usually are asked to submit the diversity statement as part of job packaging, where like we need to explain how we want to enhance or like join universities' effort to enhance this kind of diversity and equity and such. But once we arrive on campus, we realize there's no such kind of structural support for those initiatives that much. And it is usually the individual faculty members sort of like commitment and willingness, I think, especially for example, like if you want to have some sort of like critical race perspective on your syllabus, then this is, it's entirely basically up to you. And there are, of course, grants you can apply and you can maybe secure those fundings, but that's kind of like the financial issue is not that like primary issue here, but I'm more I think I wanted to address this issue of like how we can ensure this kind of critical racial perspective in the curriculum. Because if we will look into for example, Asian Studies program, I am in history department, but a lot of students majoring Asian Studies also attend my courses. And if I look at their like the Asian Studies course catalog, then predominantly they offer like language courses, but they do not have much content courses. And so usually like they have like cross list courses that you can offered by faculty members actually belong to different departments. And if the course title has something about Asia, then it counts. That's how they get credits, and then how the major is recognized. So I guess maybe UBC and Toronto are two exceptions because they have large kind of department structure for Asian Studies program. But the University of Manitoba we are one of the research intensive universities, but I found it was really surprising for me to find that actually this university doesn't have much support for Asian Studies program at all. And they only currently have like a few sessional instructors who teach language. And other than that, there's no single faculty member, the tenured faculty member there. So two things that was one is that how we can keep those, how we can ensure that we have like a proper number of faculty members who can actually run the program. And then the other issue is that this having diversity, we really need to think about perspective matters. It is not just about like having courses that the title has something about Asia, but how you approach it, those Asia matters and how you understand. So when students finish their degree and then certainly that the certificate says they majored or minored Asian Studies, but they don't have much ideas about how to understand Asia from critical perspectives or historical perspectives. So that's one of the challenges maybe I am also dealing with. And I guess we don't have a handy bag yet.
I definitely agree with you that that's definitely one of the challenges from any perspective of I guess course development, because me particularly, I'm coming from a very small university. We're 5,000 people, so particularly when it comes to addressing anything with minority groups, it is a massive challenge. And particularly when like I can understand from the administrative perspective about like when it comes down to it, the cost of running courses. But at the same point in time, like as you're saying, like if you have a program that has anything to do with a focus of Asian Studies, there should be something there to address it, particularly when you think about I don't really want to kind of shine a spotlight on Saskatchewan right now, but many of the viewers may have heard recently about the issue with University of Saskatchewan and how I think she was as a CIHR researcher in Indigenous study. There are questions regarding her identity, and obviously, regardless of the good work that she does, it undercuts the tone and, in my opinion, the meaningfulness of what they're doing when it's coming from someone who hasn't lived the same experience. And so, well, I guess one of the challenges here is like, how do you get the universities to acknowledge this? And I honestly, as a mathematician, it's a very different experience of what I normally deal with. My biggest problem is trying to get my next epidemiology class authorized through Committee on Studies. But I definitely understand the concerns, for lack of a better term, when it comes to something like this. And to put on the hat of, I guess, an administrator, I don't know, Davina or Zenab, if you want to chime in on this, because presumably you at least have a better ear for this than I do. But it is definitely obviously a challenge of how can we make administration aware of the need for it when they're, I don't want to put it in a negative context, but when their priorities may be different from our priorities as educators.
Oh, you're muted.
Thanks. I was going to say, there's so many structural challenges and barriers that are all interconnected, right? So for instance, hiring committees, they're appointed for a very limited time period, right? Like 1 year, they're on this mission to fill a position, and then that's it, they're done. Like they're not even involved in, on orientation or onboarding or long-term planning for supporting that faculty member. And I think, part of the conversation we've had is around some of the universities have started to do this cluster hiring, right? So people come in groups and they support each other, and that helps with retention and their success. But I do think that, we need to kind of take it a little bit slower as institutions and be really thoughtful and mindful about our hiring. Like these are people, right, with hopes and dreams and a lot of potential that we're bringing in. And are we setting them up for success, right? And that has to be looked at more holistically in terms of, support for teaching, support for SRC, for even looking at the culture. I know some of and we spoke about data earlier, and some of our faculty might be really keen on, sort of just increasing the numbers, right? But do they have the culture that's necessary to support faculty members? We talked about imposter syndrome. We're shifting. Now there's a recognition that it's not the person, it's actually the culture and the context that's creating the situation for the individual. So I think you have to have a multi-pronged approach in looking at this so that when we're hiring faculty members, they're actually able to succeed in all of these different facets of their roles. It's such a missed opportunity. We bring all this talent with lived experience. We have Henry back. Oh, you're on mute, Henry. You're still on mute. No. Okay, keep trying because we miss you. But yeah, I was just gonna say, like, these are real issues, right? So I think, on the surface, like if you're just sort of doing data tracking, you might say, oh yeah, we're getting better and better and better over the years, right? In terms of hiring diverse faculty, but are we actually allowing them to be successful?
Yeah, on that note, and also Derrick's point about like how we can make the university aware of the importance of those diversity and equity issues. And recently, in the process of this strike, that this gave me opportunity to learn more about universities' financial structure and the way that how the administration works. And this time, the university actually made this counter proposal on the table, and they said they put high increase in market stipend category, which is that the money actually the university can use to supplement kind of base salary to recruit new faculty members in market sensitive areas. And with practice, I actually learned in the process, but it's a huge amount of money, and with which field or which area are considered market sensitive is determined by the deans and university. So, and usually the money goes to law or business school and those areas that they think they need to be more competitive. So I had a hard time understanding this concept because on the one hand, of course, there's certainly very capitalistic kind of approach universities taking to make the institution more competitive. So I thought, how do we understand this competitiveness? I mean, as an educational institution. So how we can ensure them to think about those diversity and representation issues and such, and maybe those kind of market-oriented concept, how we can redirect those approaches. And we could potentially, I mean, it's a huge amount of money, and then if they have much kind of way, then they can create several faculty positions for like Asian studies program, for example, or for better representation of like women of color, for example, like a science field, right? So all those matters. So how do we understand those concepts and at the core of educational value? So that was another thing maybe I wanted to put on the table.
I mean, I can see Henry still trying to figure out the sound, but I just wanted to say I totally agree, Jeongmin. I think that, to your question, Derrick, about getting, the senior leadership to kind of buy in to that, I think it is tied to a lot of the competitive advantage for a university, and seeing how diversifying the faculty is going to actually, turn into that competitive advantage. I think I hear, students that kind of indicate that the landscape for what is considered professional in any sort of capacity that is coming from university, that's changing. And so, they're looking for diversity in terms of the foundational knowledge that they're getting in their different disciplines. They're looking for the evolution of the different theories in their discipline, and not just learning sort of Eurocentric information in the various programs. And I think that, that translates, like students will choose where they want to go, where they receive. Sorry, Henry, I just see you nodding your head, or kind of, are you back with us?
I think he's trying to troubleshoot still.
So I think that, it is multi aspects in terms of like how he's gone entirely. From kind of the top, and then the different factors. I think it'll be what types of research money is coming in. It'll be from the students. It'll be what is driving brand, what is creating and separating us from other institutions. And now we're really at a
So unfortunately, we don't have our moderator to help the flow. But I guess one thing that did pop into my mind, though, particularly from the various talking points, is then particularly in the context of support, because myself coming to so grew up in St. John's, not exactly a small town, but not a big city. Went to Vancouver, much bigger city, and now I'm in Antigonish, which is generally speaking, population's around 5,000, and then with students closer to 10. So summertime we drop down significantly. But for myself, my wife is from this region, so coming to a small university and this town in particular was really easy. But I'll use one of my news colleagues as an example. She came from Saskatchewan to here. She is Iranian, and our community Iranian community is really small, to the point where there's probably maybe 10 families in total, and most of them are actually from the student perspective. So then when we talk about like recruitment, retention, promotion, like how can, like particularly when you come from a big city, when you have that feeling of community, that feeling of support, what can universities do to basically remove the loneliness? Like, for example, here, one of the first things that my university does is that all the brand new professors, would be they tenure track or limit term appointment, they automatically do a 3 or 4 day faculty kind of get together, just so again they can find a support system within brand new faculty, as well as learn more about the university and the surrounding community. But again, to a certain extent, particularly in the context of not only rural Nova Scotia, but also in terms of the general demographics, anyone who falls within the normal kind of EDI umbrella, like they're getting very limited support outside the university community. And so is there something that can be done? Because like Zenab, you said like you want to recruit very carefully, and you don't want to bring in like too much of time. But at the same point in time, if there is like literally like I'm making this number up, but maybe if there's only 2 Iranian faculty members, then like you don't have that much support. Like I'm luckier. I don't really like. I have the stereotype of math. There are plenty of Asian faculty around math and computer science, but for other programs, they're maybe not as lucky.
Yeah. That's a great point, Derrick. And that's, I think we have to approach it holistically in terms of wellness, mental health, family supports, right? If they have family members. And also, there has to be some centralized leadership in terms of programming and community building. That just has to happen, right? So that you're not sort of isolated within your own department that might be very, very small or not as inclusive or welcoming. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, connecting only with people from your discipline. There's, cross sort of collaboration in terms of collaboration with people from different disciplines and getting ideas and even information on supports, right? I know we did a session a few months ago on tenure, and we actually had a faculty panel, and it was really well received. And, some of the members who had just recently gone through the tenure process successfully, they talked about NCFDD and the boot camp program there. So I feel like, there are a lot of resources out there that people don't even necessarily know about, right? Because they're so isolated. So, I really, really think that as institutionally, there has to be some leadership, some organization that brings people together, that gives them the support, and systematically, like looking at, okay, so how are we going to support them from a teaching perspective? How are we going to support them from an SRC perspective? Because you want them to have like robust support and tools to aid them in their actual duties and responsibilities, progressing towards tenure and promotion, all those, milestones in their careers, but then also the well-being aspect, the family aspect, right? All of that community aspect, that's really, really important.
And I think that if you have sorry, John, go
No,
ahead.
I think we overlap. You can go ahead, and I can do after you.
And I think that, as Zenab mentioned, if there's some sort of like grassroots, groups kind of forming, and I think that that's kind of speaking to that leadership capacity of noticing something happening, and as a leader, maybe figuring out if you've got some resource allocation that you can also help to keep that groundswell moving and creating something that could help with that community building. Sorry, Jeongmin, please.
No, I just totally agree with what has been said so far. And like this holistic approach, like a teaching perspective and research perspective, and also we are all human beings. Like we do need support for, like, for example, work, personal life balance, and who I can get along with. That was a really important question. Like why I mean, personally, I moved from New York City to Winnipeg, and then in between, I lived in Shanghai for 2 years. So in each city, that luckily, that Winnipeg is also relatively very diverse and culturally and population-wise and ethnically, but so I think this cultural diversity, depending on how we define this concept, but it's really important, of course, kind of welcoming environment that we can offer to new faculty members. But at the same time, I totally hear you, Derrick, that if I have like only 2 more Korean people around in the city, that can be really lonely. But at the same time, I think it's really beyond my sort of like racial or like ethnic affinity, because sometimes when people ask me about like those questions about like based on assumption that I am Korean and I know of Korean culture and such, that makes me I know what I mean, right? So so I'm trying to think about how we can ensure those community building, for example, for me, like broader sort of like BIPOC communities beyond my own racial background, for example. So those matters, maybe we could, so as Zenab said, that if we have sort of like kind of supporting system, and we disappeared again, they can.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Do this like new.
Okay. Now the problem is over on the feed loop side. Yeah.
Henry, we can hear you.
Oh.
Yeah, we can hear you, but I don't see you.
We cannot see you, but we can hear you. Can you hear us? I think we've lost him. There he is. Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Sorry, the problem is now I can't hear you. So
you can't hear us?
We're not there yet. My apologies for the technical issues. Please keep going without me. I'm going to try one more time to come in because now my microphone works, but I can't hear you. So sorry, everyone. I'm going to cut out.
So anyway, to finish it, what I was going to say, that so this holistic approach is important, and then we can bring in all these new perspectives that the new faculty members bring in together. So like kind of the connections across all different kind of communities and such. And also this Henry's technical issues remind me of this COVID specific kind of situation we are in. I started in 2019, and I only taught in person one semester, and then everything turned online. So that isolation issue has been quite significant for, I think, the faculty members who are recently hired. And that's certainly, I think, one of the factors, not only for the moment, but maybe if we're thinking about like post-pandemic kind of situation as well. So those awareness and yeah, how we can get back to the campus and such. So yeah, another point the Henry situation reminded me of.
So if I were to, in some sense, summarize, I guess, some of the talking points here, it seems like really the culture of the university will play a very large role that eventually can lead to some meaningful solutions. Am I kind of hearing that kind of tone? Because I completely agree that proper support is always one of the biggest challenges. And I use a colleague as an example. He recently got sick, and he's been around at his university for a few years, but single guy. And unfortunately, when he got sick, it honestly was for the first few days, it was really on him to take care of himself. And luckily, a few of his colleagues end up kind of helping out, but obviously restrictions with COVID made things more difficult. But from the university side, there was very little support for him specifically. So like, again, like the whole idea of like a culture that collegiality, to steal a term that my chair uses, is obviously very important to creating the best culture possible that may eventually lead to some more meaningful changes.
Yeah, I was gonna, actually, that's a really good point, because I think, oh, now my voice is echoing. Can you all hear my echo? No? Okay, well, I'll keep talking then. I won't take too long, but I just wanted to build on that, because I think that's that issue that you raised, Derrick, it sort of speaks to equipping faculty members with a certain level of education that creates that atmosphere. A lot of times faculty don't know how to behave. If they have a colleague on sick leave, for instance, they might not necessarily know what to say or not to say, right? So when we start conversations about all kinds of things in terms of how do you create an inclusive work environment? What does that look like? What are microaggressions? What is tokenization? And it's surprising to me, like I've been on a learning journey myself, because some of the things that I learn about that seem so subtle and yet could be so offensive and hurtful, right? And so I think creating a culture where you start to share information without making people feel like there's something that they're doing wrong or there's something that's wrong with them, but creating a culture of education and understanding hopefully gets us to a better place where we can support each other. Henry, can you hear us?
Do you have a microphone? We can't hear you.
I hear you.
But to actually talk on your point, I completely agree, and I'll use a bit of an this education in some sense and understanding. I'll use a bit of an anecdote from my own experience. When I was younger, an undergrad, and as I kind of understood, like I wanted to go to grad school, I wanted to eventually get my doctorate. One of my professors told me that, and it sounds very bad, but he told me I was lucky in terms of who I was in my name when it came to recruitment, when it came to grants, when it came to something like that. And what I mean by that is I go by an anglicized Derrick, but then my middle name is my Chinese name, Lee. And he kind of basically went that, he said how like you can play on the Asian side of things to make you look good, but you're not that Asian. That where language skills may become a barrier, where there may be concerns relating to that. And he unofficially would tell people who had a full Asian name, maybe you might want to go by a more anglicized first name, just again to help with your own CV, to help with job perspectives and so forth. And as you're talking, and the reason why I'm talking about this is again this idea of culture and education. It's like that mentality. Although I understand why he said it, is so kind of antiquated and just a very wrong approach to playing on our stereotypes, for lack of a better term. Like we are like growing up, I had every single stereotype thrown at me. Kind of, I unfortunately tick all the boxes. I played piano. I had an abacus. I was good at computers. I was good at math. Now, math for me was not a natural skill, but my father, being a statistics professor, made sure I was trained well. But throughout my entire life, those microaggressions of, oh, I can go to you for math help. Oh, I can go to you to help fix my computer. These were things that I grew up that I honestly wasn't ever aware of or think anything against until grad school, when I learned more about like, yeah, these are not traits that people should be playing on. And so I think these type of conversations and bringing them up and shining a spotlight that, yeah, okay, they're positive, but they're not good things for us to really focus on.
I don't know if everybody can hear me now. You can hear it? Okay. So my apologies again for the series of technical issues. I'm going to blame Apple because I have an Apple laptop. So I was listening in though, and thanks Derrick for the last sharing of that. I'm wondering what I hear is that there's this idea that to help people, in their career trajectories, that there should be mentorship, and it strikes me that often we hear stories about really bad mentorship, chairs and senior colleagues taking someone aside and giving the kinds of advice that actually can be debilitating, which is what I hear in Derrick's last story, which is and so thinking about what kind of mechanisms can we perhaps raise for mentorship that perhaps is more useful, for networks and connections among senior colleagues who aren't perhaps people who are well-meaning, but reinforcing debilitating stereotypes or making or giving advice that frankly it may work if you are white and male, but doesn't work if you are non-white and non-male. I mean, again, we know this in terms of gendered advice that just is not going to work for the person who's being advised. And so I guess I'll throw that out to others. Do you see some good workplace practices that you might want to think about? Geez, if we did this instead of that. I think one of the things that is really difficult is how to retain people. We see losses mentioned in some earlier discussions. That what are some of the mechanisms that you as faculty for Jeongmin and Derrick, but also from your experiences seeing people, what are the things that lead people to leave and quit and even leave academia? We've heard people talk about how they've just decided other careers are easier. So what are some of the things that we can think about that keep people going? Derrick, yeah.
So mine's from a slightly different perspective, but I guess it does kind of play into the general theme. Is that obviously being in a rural university, there are challenges with EDI, but also being in a rural university, there are challenges with respect to spousal hires. My wife is also an academic, and she's a limited term appointment. And eventually it's going to come to a point where we have to consider, okay, do we stay here or do we have to go, unfortunately, to a bigger city? And that's just part of the life. It's part of the life of an academic, but it's not part of a life that we all recognize. Sometimes we don't want to address, but it is a challenge that it personally can weigh heavily on us. And so for me, like in particular, I don't want to quite admit to it, but it is something that it is constantly on my mind. Do I have to go to a bigger city? And just because as a statistician, I am more flexible. So I don't necessarily have to go to academia. I can go back to the private sector. But again, for me, this is something that I have the ability to. If you're in a field that is less employable or just not, because the pandemic is obviously has shown spotlight on so many issues with the job market. Like some people don't have that freedom that I potentially could have. So I don't know. Like I said, it's a challenge. And so from the perspective of what can they do to help retain? Obviously spousal hires is a really big appeal, because if you look into the US, for example, I know a lot of smaller particularly liberal arts colleges, they will advertise hey, will we do spousal hires to kind of bring you in? And particularly in the context of if you want to retain people, universities need to understand there's a high likelihood that this person, if they have a spouse, that spouse is probably going to be someone who has a PhD or equivalent who wants a job as well.
That's a great concrete example, and one I think that in fact often is cited as a problem with equity. Well, if we do spousal hires, it's going to actually be against equity in other ways. And so work-life balance, again, the personal lives of faculty, including things like spousal and other forms of appointment that keep people happy, as are a crucial part of retention often. So I'm glad you raised something like that.
I just wanted to. We actually just recently introduced some new language in our faculty collective agreement around the option available to hiring committees to recommend a spousal hire where the applicant is from an equity group, which I'm really excited about. So I don't know how it's actually going to play out, but at least it gives me some hope in terms of being able to do you know, something concrete and with respect to hiring diverse faculty.
And we often see that that's actually something that that superstars get, and the fairness issue doesn't seem to ever come up there. It's like, well, of course, it's obvious that this person really, who's highly recruited, and generally, again, it's racialized and gendered in many ways. So I'm glad to see that that kind of specifically saying this is also a criteria for when we apply spousal hires. Jeongmin, you were.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I was going to also say that. Well, Derrick, I kind of like have the same situation. My partner is also an academic, and we both happen to be in humanities and different discipline. But in the process of like negotiation with the university, I found myself as a woman of color in the humanities field. That didn't put me in necessarily like a stronger position. Yeah. And the dean was very ready to reject what I was asking for. And later I learned, after I started, and I learned like other faculty members, like male white faculty members in different departments got much better deals. And compared to my career and their career, even though I had more kind of experience in teaching and research and such. Yeah. So I think maybe this point can go back to Zenab's point about this cultural kind of like transformations we need to bring in to campus, because culture doesn't change overnight. And it is not only about like among our faculty members or those, but also the leadership needs to be educated. And the way they see this equity and diversity, so when I attended, for example, that new faculty orientation, that of course, that all these VP, the vice president kind of like leadership or like male, likely white guys. And even though they are talking about this diversity issue, but it didn't feel like they really have kind of concrete experiences and such. So how we can ensure that they really internalize those values, and what kind of like educational program we can adopt to get there. So I think those things we need to think about, those mentorship for those individual faculty members and other university members as well. But also like how we can change the leadership's kind of like perspective and perception of those matters as well.
Thanks, Davina, I don't know if you had, Zenab, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, if Davina, you had any observations?
I mean, I think everybody's just made really, really great points. I know we've kind of covered a lot of different ground. I think, what I hear from some of the newer faculty members and things that they get the most excited about, I hear about, definitely mentorship. And I think you're right in terms of really getting proper, mentorship that isn't going to be damaging and isn't going to be full of microaggressions and advice that's counterproductive. The other component that I admit, from an administrative perspective, I don't have a ton of experience, but I hear a lot about interdisciplinary research opportunities as well. And I think part of that is also kind of mentorship related, or just kind of relationship developing, networking opportunities to kind of broaden just beyond their department, broaden beyond faculty. And then the other component with that is like community-based research, being able to do the research that matters the most to them, and be able to make that mark. Those two things are additional components that aren't necessarily faculty recruitment, but part of the retention that I see.
It's an interesting point you've made, because it's come up in previous panels today, and as well, I think it came up a lot in June in the national forum that was convened at UBC. Is that often, again, faculty of color often bring, not always, but often bring innovative approaches that in fact are not a part of the criteria of what make, quote, excellent research. And this goes to the question of universities as meritocracies, and merit being built around criteria that rewards the people already there, and seemingly these are universal criteria of excellence, versus ones, and you mentioned a couple specific things, community-based research versus studying non-white communities, indigenous communities as insects and objects colonial knowledge. Again, the difference in approach of relationship building with communities, so that you're not doing hit and run research. You're not just coming in and saying, what's wrong with these people, write a report, and then move on to the next thing. And that has been rewarded, across the board. And it's not just humanities, but a kind of sense of there's a problem with this community. We name problems, anti-Chinese racism. Why do we name racism against Chinese as by the victims? Anti-Muslim, again, we even think of problems often by the people who are the targets or those who suffer. And so we see this in health fields, we see this in many social sciences, is the problems are named for the people who are the object of the exclusion and of the denial. And often, again, I've seen this among many junior colleagues who, when they come with a different approach, which requires that extra time to build relationships with community, that requires trust building and requires a reciprocal set of relations, so that you don't do hit and run research, that not only is that not valorized, but it often is penalized in the sense that, well, you didn't get to your second book, or your second study isn't different enough, therefore you're not a scholar of breadth. You keep on doing the same material, or why are you still working again with that same community, versus if you were to become more of a broader scholar. And so I raised some of these as to kind of throw out as how are our criteria and their application to evaluation in your eyes? Is that part of the problem? Do we need to change the way we understand excellence? So again, I've heard phrases like inclusive excellence, but meritocracy is a very powerful concept based around existing norms. Going back to, again, Derrick talking about cultures and norms. What are the existing norms of what appears to be excellent, what appears to be leadership, what doesn't get legible? Yeah, Jeongmin, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I totally agree with you, Henny, and especially in the history, like you are in history as well, right? So for us, our research takes time, and the ways in which that the research excellence and also kind of productivity are measured, that needs to be, I think, discipline specific. But from maybe university's perspective, for example, that the grant money that we can bring in, the amount is really relatively smaller than the money that maybe people in science field and engineering and such can bring in. Like if we apply for shark money, for example, that I don't know how I can build up the budget form that for like over $50,000 maybe, which might not be that much money for people in different fields. So the ways in which that sort of like productivity and then research contributions are measured. Again, that is quantifiable versus maybe quality-based and the quantity-based kind of like approach that we can certainly talk about. I think that's really important point. And also, I think this might be another line of point can make, but faculty with maybe dependent care, like they totally need different kind of like timeline consideration as well. So in this process of bargaining at my institution, then one of the major issues to be put on the table is that we do need a structural support for faculty, especially junior faculty members with dependent care, the child care duty. And it's not only for female faculty members. We do want, of course, this equal share of this child care between two parents and such. But in the ways in which that these kind of like duties and the balance between life and work it's really a structural issue, and the university, especially this pandemic oriented kind of like forced to kind of like overwork we all do these days, and the university simply says that we basically are all in the same situation, so there is no specific consideration we can make. So how we can make sure that actually it is about diversity issue and it is about the gender issue and such.
It's a great example. Thanks for bringing that up. This idea that fairness is one size fits all. That in order to be fair, we have to treat everybody the same. I remember my partner is also did her PhD, and the fact that that SSHRC would support someone having a child while they were doing their PhD and not penalize them by treating everyone the same, which is, if we support a woman for having a child while doing their PhD, then that's somehow unfair. And switching the criteria to one where, if there is an underrepresentation of women in a field doing doctorates, that perhaps understanding why they're not able to stay in or drop out, or what would lead them, what would incentivize. So that brings me to a kind of thing, the carrots and sticks. I mean, we've talked about obstacles in some sense to faculty of color advancing in their careers, or even being recruited, even being hired, but also being promoted. We've talked about some of the cultural norms, so to speak, of academia that really are problematic in blocking. We've talked a little bit about some things that are ideas you've had about increasing perhaps the retention possibilities and opportunities. Are there some carrots and sticks in your minds too about trying to change structures? What are some of the ways in which those people who perhaps don't understand, but it's a long haul sometimes to have to convince every new administrator anew. They serve for five years and sometimes 8, and then another one comes along. Are there things in your mind, if we just changed it this way, a carrot or a stick that says, if you just can't do X anymore? I don't. Often if we're just trying to get this came up as a metaphor, if we're just trying to get a seat at the table, that's one thing. But if the table's, the problem, then often we do need things like, a change in the structure of how people get to the table, how many are at the table, how decisions are made at the table, whether you get to stay at the table if you don't conform to the behavior of everyone else at the table. So there's lots of ways, just to use that table metaphor and flog it to death, perhaps. And if we're talking about the kind of what is it that's seen to be polite and the right thing to do, and if you're at the table, you better conform. I'm hearing a lot of that as well in some of your comments about fitting in, and perhaps that just leaves the table as is. So again, I'll throw it out for you to talk about what do you see in your mind as some things that if you saw, maybe a carrot or a stick being changed here or there, it could be in any realm. Yeah.
I'll go.
Yeah, please.
I mean, I would say one of the sticks maybe for the environment that we're in Toronto is the rapidly increasing diversity in our community. Yeah. And, so we can't wait to, we just don't have the luxury of time as an institution, right, to act on certain things. And so that's been a bit of a carrot. I'm sure most academic plans out there incorporate EDI values. But, I find that slowly we're getting to a place where it's embedded in our collective agreements, our policies, our procedures, training, and all of those different facets. And I think leadership is very important, and we're addressing it through that lens as well, in terms of, our deans, our associate deans, our chairs, directors, having those conversations about inclusive leadership. And then special training for our committees as well. So I think there are so many different ways that you can tackle this, and you do need to tackle it. But yeah, that I would say has been one of the sort of sources of motivation for us.
Great, thanks. I mean, some practical things, in other words, that are happening, if unevenly. Okay. Others, I don't know if others have thoughts that even if it's personal to you, like if this was a difference, I'd have a lot easier time. Or if this, it's hard to imagine sometimes a stick. I've been in enough committees at different levels where the values, as you said, are we all believe in the values, and yet nothing's changing. And so, and we've heard that in previous conversations, where that starts to leave a kind of a sense of hypocrisy too, is that the people in the right places and high places are saying the right thing, but why are things not changing? And again, what are we, perhaps there's not the proper incentive systems and disincentive systems right now. I'll give an example, and it's very personal, just as you continue to think. I'm an associate professor. If I had stayed at University of California, there's no way I'd still be an associate professor. And so if you asked me why, I'd say one reason is I don't trust my peers in my field here. In the US, I had confidence that if I went up for full, I'd done more than enough strange things that were still legible. But here, I was asked to come back to Canada to build programs that I thought would take 3 to 5 years to build, took 8 to 12 years. That building relationships with the communities were just not legible in terms of how people in my profession are judged. It's monographs, it's publications, it's like the fact that you've developed relationships with communities that take a lot of time to nurture. And so in some sense, I did not think, and this is not emotional, I don't, it's quite cold. I assessed that the way that people in my discipline assess the things I do, it wasn't going to be legible. It didn't matter. Sometimes I'm a tenured professor, so I can't be fired. But still, the idea that what passes as knowledge and how you produce it was just not going to be legible in my mind. And that now, if you'd asked me when I left 17 years ago from UCLA, whether I knew that this was going to be a cost to coming teaching here at home, so to speak, no. I took a pay cut as well to come to Canada. So I say all of this because there are these ways in which faculty and I would say staff as well at universities often make choices, where they weigh the benefits of doing this or of not doing that. And well, in order to get tenure, in order to be promoted, I'll choose this path instead of that path. We are all the sum of our decisions. But I think in that sense, when we think of faculty retention, recruitment, the evaluation mechanisms that we've been talking about, and as I hope as others think about within their own institutions, there are also a lot of personal journeys and choices that people make. And often that involves making decisions about how your work will be evaluated and whether the reward systems, are set up. And I've no doubt that for many faculty, especially those who've advanced in their careers, there's been many choices that have been made to not do certain things because they're not going to be rewarded. And so it's one of the reasons why I raised the issue of that. We have a few minutes left, and so any kind of last points you just want to, and maybe we can do a kind of a rapid fire, just some things that to you after this conversation, something that you'd want to leave with people in thinking about the issues of faculty representation, and recruitment and retention and promotion. Just some last thoughts. Davina, why don't we start with you and go around the horn?
Ooh, that's a big question. I mean, I'm still thinking about the carrot and the stick. But I think, the biggest thing in terms of, what I hope that folks will walk away from is that, if you are participating and, are fortunate to be on a hiring committee and you have, the trust of your department, the trust of your faculty to be influencing that process, is that, you are giving some pause. And I know that there are, if I have to hear about implicit bias training one more time, and I understand that, it becomes almost like a complacent, the lipstick, the lip service, but there really is something more to learn in that. When you think something, that you actually need to go back and learn more about it. And that you take a pause, you think about those norms that you're used to. What are you learning? What are you leaning back towards in terms of traditional knowledge? Or what are you more comfortable with, and this is your idea of what's going to work in the recruitment, what's going to work in a promotion, and that you're really giving more thought to that, because you really do have a massive influence in the process.
Thanks, Davina. Jeongmin, Zenab, Derrick, any last thoughts?
Yes, it was really good to hear from all different perspectives, and I of course that gave me more things to think about. But just to go back to Henry's point about like this community building kind of like things, and what kind of activities and research we do, and how they were like assessed and evaluated in what ways, especially as junior faculty member, that it's kind of hard choice to make, because of course I want to be involved in these initiatives and such more actively, but I have to also think about my tenure clock and like other research productivity as well. But the way I try to see is kind of like there is a consistency between my research in, for example, like the criticism of capitalism and imperialism and those feminism and those issues, and the things I want to do with communities, kind of broader communities in the city, and like non-academic sort of like the network I want to build. So I think, Henry, your case that really set a kind of really important model for junior faculty members as well, because there is not the only way we should be judged and assessed. And those kind of like criteria needs to be more diversified, and also that's how we contribute to the university, to kind of diversity sort of like principles as well, because we do need some sort of like university level task force for these kind of like initiatives. But in reality, many of those kind of activities were led by and initiated by individual faculty members, which is a case in my university. So we should reward those activities and contributions. And in that sense, I thank you for doing so, and I will keep doing that, because that's really important.
I'm glad you keep doing things that are meaningful to you as well, and in some sense having the strength to make those choices. I applaud all those faculty and researchers who again are making sometimes difficult choices that they know may impact their own career. Zenab, Derrick.
So I guess several things have been kind of floating through my mind just in the past few minutes, including going back to the stick versus the carrot, because I guess one of the biggest problems is, in some sense, it's a little bit of a loaded question, because obviously every university has very unique challenges. Again, from my case, rural versus an urban university, how we deal with that is going to be obviously very different between McGill versus Saskatchewan versus UNBC. But I guess several things that kind of pop into my mind, particularly in the context of several of the components that we've been talking about, is that we obviously need some level of diversity in basically everything within the context of the university, because understanding the worth of what we do, like I obviously as a mathematician and as a statistician, like how I am evaluated, how I'm being appraised is very different from someone from the humanities. And so, like, as Jeongmin was talking about in terms of like SSHRC and justifying the cost of this, for me, it's easy to justify a $100,000 grant when I do stuff with genetic research. Like that's $30,000 gone to Genome Quebec or somebody. And so it's important to have diversity just because of the different perspectives that are being brought to the table. In terms of if I were to give a general message to university administration as well as people on the hiring committees, particularly from my view, not only as an Asian, but also my view as someone who I'm from an academic family, is understanding your privilege. And this has nothing to do with like white versus Asian versus any that type of approach, but it's understanding that wherever you got, like I'm a professor. I didn't get here strictly because of my own merit. I got here because of people helping me. And one of the biggest things I've kind of noticed with some people I know is they don't recognize that, like, no, like your life was easier because your parent was either an academic, so you understood the system, or that your parent paid for university. And so in the context of like then recruitment in terms of a hiring committee, so it's understanding that yes, obviously publications mean a lot when we're trying to hire somebody, but the challenges that they overcame are just as important to understand the person that they are, and again their worth. And so if I were to come to that side, it's just like it's obviously a much more complex scenario than simply, oh, this person has no publication record, therefore they're not worth hiring.
Thanks, Derrick. Thanks for that. And maybe last word to you then. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I just realized this. I was thinking about this earlier from the perspective of the diverse individual, right? So the faculty member, the candidate, and we go through so many systemic barriers throughout our lives from the moment that we're born, that when we get to a place of, say, because Jeongmin talked about this earlier, how she wished she could have negotiated a better offer when she did, right? And, we just often feel so grateful to be in a place of receiving an offer or receiving tenure, whatever that might be, that we don't think of ourselves as deserving more. And that's what I really want to communicate, because I think even when we look at hiring, for instance, there are actually resources and supports available. For instance, our faculty association actually meets with candidates. So when the candidate receives an offer, they're officially not even part of the association at that point, and yet they're offering to meet with that individual to talk about, to go through the offer letter, to say, to help them understand, to help them negotiate. We have various different networks for different groups, for instance, Black faculty and staff networks. So there are resources that candidates can connect to. And I would say similarly for, faculty who are, hired and are eventually going through the tenure process or promotion process, you sort of have to intentionally seek out all of those supports and resources and make use of them. Because no system is going to be perfect. I think about all the progress we've made, even in our recent collective agreement, for instance, we have a role of an equity advocate now on hiring committees and evaluation committees too. And, just as an example, one of the hiring committees that I was recently looking at, and just out of curiosity, who they picked for the role of the equity advocate, turns out, out of all the members who are so experienced, tenured, all of that, the person that's going to be their equity advocate is somebody who's junior. And so that's what I mean when I say it's never going to be a perfect system. It's hard work. And so we all have to realize that too. I think we can never just, sort of let our guard down and say, okay, now, I think we're in a good place. We have to keep at it.
On that note, I think thanks for, in some sense, summarizing the discussion too, that there are challenges, and there are many ways in which I think things can change and should change and have to change. So I thank all of you for sharing and opening up today and sharing some of your own experiences as well as others that you've observed. And yeah, hopefully as this discussion continues, there'll be another panel actually talking about, again, faculty recruitment and retention and promotion, that this actually also provides a springboard for their discussion. So my thanks again to all of you and to all the people who've been listening and yeah, sending some messages as well of support for what you've been raising. So I'm going to end and thank the organizers at X University for hosting and convening this discussion as well as the others over these 2 days. So thanks, everyone. Let's see. I think there's a Zoom. I don't know whether they've shut off the feed loop already to